tell me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I'm sure that you've all seen this flyer for our event at this point. And I have to tell you, when I first saw this flyer, as we were working on it, sort of looked at it several times before it was complete, I hated this picture of Gary Tillman. And I hated it because it was so clear that he was sick and that he was tired. If you look at the picture of his skin and his eyes, it's clear that he had very little time. But then, the more I saw it, because his wife uses this picture as well to announce sort of the developments that have followed after his death, I came to realize why it was important, which was that he is sick and he is tired. But it's just so clear that all of that just affirms how important it was to continue to have a sense of vision. And so I, in many ways, see what we're doing today as trying to figure out what he was looking at in this picture, at what he was gazing. Because in many ways, as anybody who had the pleasure of meeting Gary knows, he was a really visionary and bold person, and he would want us to see, he would want to see us continuing this work. But it's funny because this has been hanging up in the department where I work, so I keep walking by it, and it's funny to see an image of somebody who's become an elder. So you look at them, they look back at you. But the thing that always inspired me most about Gary was that he always had the sense that you needed to try to be really smart, and that you needed to try to be incredibly courageous, and that it was never enough to be one of those things, that you had to be both. And that's hard, but he exemplified it so well. So, sorry, I haven't talked about Gary in public since he died, so it's very hard to do. But anyway, I'm going to talk briefly today about the research and conclusions that I drew in my first book, which was an exploration of the struggles over community-controlled schooling in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, Brooklyn in the late 60s. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of those conflicts before? Okay, terrific. I'm never sure, because there's a real generational divide in knowledge about these kinds of things. And the other reason I ask is, I'm the daughter of South African Jews who moved to Chicago.
Can you slow down just about
Sure.
10 miles an hour?
10 miles an hour. Okay, I'll try. Tell me if I'm revving back up. Okay. And louder. Okay.
Stay to the mic.
More into the mic.
Yes.
Okay. So I hadn't heard about these events because I'm the daughter of South African Jews who moved to the Midwest, and as other Chicagoans know, New York isn't the center of the world for everyone on Earth. And there are other places where events unfolding in New York doesn't mean that the world is unfolding with it. Okay. And so I actually learned about these conflicts through one of Julius Lester's many autobiographies, the one called Love Song, Becoming a Jew. And this was a particularly good way, I think, of first encountering these events, because for anyone who hasn't heard of them, the conflicts are frequently invoked as a breaking point in the historic liberal Black-Jewish alliance. And when it's talked about as a historic liberal Black-Jewish alliance, the assumption is that all of the blacks involved are Christian and all of the Jews involved are white. And yet Julius Lester was writing about these events as a black Jew, right? And the other thing I actually just want to say quickly about it, because I wasn't here earlier and this may have been a theme that already emerged, is Julius Lester is a lot like many other Jews of color, right? Which is that he went through the process of formally converting to Judaism only to find out that he already was a Jew. And so the act of formally becoming a Jew was an act of return, which is, I know how you describe Judaism for many of us. And so the way that this conflict is usually described is, as I said, it's often considered with a lot of lamentation, that this is a moment of breaking down of possibilities, of breaking down of coalitions. And yet, when I looked into this event, what I saw was something very different. And there's sort of 2 points on which I sort of want to focus, and then I'm going to sort of recount the events quickly for anybody who's not familiar with them. But the way that I would describe this conflict, instead of just sort of this breaking point to lament, is that the late 60s is a period which followed some tremendous victories, but they were primarily legal and they were primarily formal. And when it came time to actually try to figure out what that would mean concretely for the lives of people, a series of fracturings went on, right? And the easiest way of describing them is as a fracture between liberal and radical elements of both Jews and blacks and Jews. And the way that I would describe that is that the liberal faction of that divide remained satisfied with the victories that had been won, and with a sense that you could succeed and advance and educational opportunities could be made available through the established mechanisms. Whereas more radical approaches said something very different, which was it's economic mobility, educational opportunity, they're available so long as you can assimilate. And you can assimilate as an individual person of color, but not as a group. I mean, blacks as a group cannot assimilate through established mechanisms, was the argument of this, of this faction that I'm talking about. But the other thing that really changed in the moment of the late 60s is that civil rights movements, that we sort of trumpet and we can all agree to love, right? All of them, the focal point was the federal government, right? And what began to change in the late 60s was, okay, we've accomplished these legal reforms, what are they going to mean for us? And it meant turning to the question of power, right? But in the context of New York City, and especially New York City public schools, when you looked at the face of power, it was often a white Jewish face, right? And so the shift from civil rights to black power was a shift that really sort of changed the tenor of what had gotten to that point. And so one of the things that's always interested me, and I just want to sort of say this as a backdrop comment before telling you about these actual events, is that for people who hated the civil rights movement, we have to remember there were such people, many of them, right? It was depicted as a violent movement, right? I mean, everybody sort of associates civil rights with being peaceful, et cetera. And yet the whole point of it was to reveal the violence of an anti-black society and to do it on mass TV, right? And so for people who didn't like the civil rights movement, that divide that we commonly draw between peaceful and non-peaceful civil rights and black power is not actually so neat. But one of the things that happened with that turn that I was describing to looking at who actually controlled power in New York City was that when the target shifted, all of a sudden considerations about what counted as violent did as well. And so for the people who were suddenly targeted, who before had been doing the targeting, a movement which in fact, it was aggressive to the extent that it was identifying real issues, but it was certainly not violent in any sense, and yet it was perceived as such because it was trying to threaten an established status quo. So let me speak just briefly about what actually happened. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to,
Oh.
and just very quickly.
Can I just close that? Or is it?
No, we just, if we could, transfer to move the cursor right here in memory, and put the screen back on.
In memory?
Yeah, it's those.
Ken, why don't I just close it? Oh, yes.
Yeah, and then it's, oh, wrong.
That's not
Oh, the flyer.
The flyer, yeah, symposium flyers. There we go, great, okay.
But we should do a full screen. I didn't do a full screen.
View.
View. Okay. Oh, I see.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you,
So can
and
picture us
nice
next.
and loud.
Okay. All right. So it's good to have something coming up from my husband. so the backdrop for the struggle over community-controlled schooling, which is worth bearing in mind because it's often forgotten, was the racially segregated public school system of New York City. Right? And between 1960 and 1965, there have been at least 3 separate deliberate attempts to desegregate the New York City public school system as a whole. This is a massive school system, which is sort of worth bearing in mind. And in each instances, all of these efforts were in response to organized struggle, and in 2 cases to citywide boycotts. Right? And in the decade previous to this, more than 1 million whites had left the city, leading to a 20% drop in white student enrollment, at the same time as there had been an infusion of 400,000 blacks and Latinos moving in. And so each time the Board of Education tried to make any kind of leap or move toward integration, it had inspired immediate, dramatic, and sometimes violent white responses. Right? And so, for instance, there were efforts to bus students across the city, and what frequently happened to the individual black students who were bused across was they would arrive and there were angry mobs of whites with baseball bats yelling, "Niggers go home." And similarly, when some of those black students, including the ones from Ocean Brownsville, arrived at those schools, they were often sent to individual all-black classrooms, and most of them begged to go home and to stop this project. And there were other efforts as well to intervene in how schools would be zoned, and in each effort, the community efforts, civil rights efforts, were met with real intransigence. So in the face of that, in 1967, there was a collaborative effort between the Board of Education, the mayor at the time, who was John Lindsay, members of the Ford Foundation, and factions of this community in Ocean Brownsville and Brooklyn, who joined forces to try to create an experimental school district. And the idea was to have 8 schools that would be run by a local community board. And yet the debate over its specific powers, whether it could hire and fire, the degree of its control over its budget, whether it would control how it was that the schools would be evaluated, was actually never resolved. The school was taken apart, and the entire experiment was sort of shut down before those actual powers were delineated. But at the same time, for 2 years, these schools were run, right? And so what ended up happening was there was a group that had been pushing for community control, and they constituted an elected local governing board, right? And it did things like determine curriculum and said we run the schools, right? And yet there was a sense from the very beginning that there was a real tension between the teachers who had been in the school before it became the experiment and the people who were running it, right? And there were charges from the very beginning on the part of the teachers that there had been a black power takeover of the schools, right? And there were hoodlum elements who were running the schools. And the people who were running the schools, for their part, what they were trying to do were actually, were fairly straightforward, kind of non-controversial things, right? They were asking, in schools where, in communities where schools consistently fail their students, should we try to do something about this? Don't we need to make these the center of communities, the sources of economic regeneration? And yet, what sort of pushed this to a real head was that there was also at the same time simmering a real conflict between the Board of Education and the United Federation of Teachers, which was predominantly a right Jewish organization. Right? And so, as the school year began, because what essentially happened is they set it up over the summer. They created a governing board, they planned for the year, they consulted with his teachers, and the relationships became very hostile. But at the very start of the year, they transferred over, they requested a transfer over of a series of assistant principals and principals to the Board of Education. And the UFT, which had been battling with them already, branded them firings and immediately went on strike. Right? And one of the things that had led up to the conflict was that there was an unsettled contract between the United Federation of Teachers and the Board of Education at the time. And one of the specific issues that the United Federation of Teachers had been fighting for was greater rights of teachers to suspend and expel disruptive kids. And a lot of the civil rights groups, the community notion of Brownsville, and black teachers throughout the city were incredibly opposed to this bill, because they saw it basically as giving more leverage for kicking out the very kids who needed to be better served by the schools. Right? And so the year when the school is to be run, what breaks out is a citywide strike, where the union is out on strike. And the community had decided that they would try to keep the schools running, and they did. They brought in parents, teachers from other parts of the city came in and worked there as well. And yet, the conflicts continue to sort of escalate. And what ended up happening in sort of the public perceptions of this was that Albert Shanker, who was the head of the union, claimed that there were basically hoodlum black power hoodlums running the school, and that what kids were being taught were black power slogans. Right? And McCoy, who was the director of the school for his part, had said, look, it's very clear there's a downward spiral going on in the quality of public education with kids of color in inner cities. And what we need to develop is a core of teachers who come from these communities and who see how they fare as their way of gauging the quality of our schools and of our nation. Because one of the concerns of a lot of parents was these schools could fail and it didn't seem to make anyone lose sleep about how we as a nation, or we as a public school system, how fare. Right? And yet, one of the difficulties that McCoy and others encountered was that some of their staunchest critics were liberals and social democrats, right? And one of the reasons why was they frequently sort of saw black power and assumed that black power was divisive, hostile, and violent, and that this wasn't, in fact, a project of community control. What it was a few individual people with a will to power who were seeking through these mechanisms to boost themselves up in ways that they considered to be deserved. Right? But in making that argument, one of the things that they failed to remember were all of the failed integrationist efforts that had led up to this point, right? Because what they consistently said was they considered this as a first move rather than as a last resort. Because what people like McCoy reiterated again and again and again is that they've been trying through liberal mechanisms, through protests, through boycotts, et cetera, to make these, to achieve these ends. But it was precisely because they had failed that they had turned to the question of power. And yet all of the coverage of it assumed this was sort of the first resort rather than the last one. And that included, in terms of spokespeople, very prominent left-wing Jewish intellectuals, right? So if you look at some of the writing by someone like Hannah Arendt at the time, she was a staunch critic of efforts like these and the related ones that were going on at City College, right? And in some ways, it was the failure of this community-controlled effort that led to the open admissions campaign around City College. But she said in both instances that what she saw going on was that this was an effort of black activists to deliberately lower standards. That their sort of moving into the system must have meant a lowering of academic standards. And she didn't understand why these efforts were being indulged. And similarly, Michael Walzer, who's also a left-leaning Jewish voice, a very prominent one, repeatedly described the politics of Black power as a politics of gesture that quickly became plastic. And so what gathered around this event was a very particular way of narrating it, of saying what it was that had happened. And what struck me about it, and the reason I'm talking about it in this context, is that if you see the way that it was covered in the press, but if you also see almost all of the subsequent coverage of it, there's a real monopoly on who it is that appears as reasonable in this conflict. And it's very clearly a predominantly white Jewish union. The sense is that the union represented general interests. The union was caring for job security, whereas the sort of self-interested, narrow, particular Black community was trying to undercut significant progress that the union had made. And it's worth also reiterating that the union itself had really, it had taken a while to gather the power that it had. By this stage, it was a powerful union, but this itself was a political victory, right? And so the union itself was very against decentralization as a policy, right? And community control implies decentralization. There's no way communities have control if you don't decentralize. And for members of the union, it was through centralization that they were able to lobby the Board of Education, that they were able to make advances, that they were able to create job security. So for them, this idea of having all of these different little bodies, each trying to control their own schools, for them reminded them of sort of board bosses, parochialism, and they saw it as a potential nightmare. Right? But what really shifted things and sort of made them take a horrible downward turn was where in the midst of, so you have to imagine sort of ongoing strikes, ongoing tension, insults being hurled back and forth, but then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, and I think we need to ask why it seemingly came from nowhere, these pamphlets emerged that were staunchly anti-Semitic, right? And they said things like, Black history is being taught in these schools, it can't be taught by Middle East blood-sucking exploiters. So it was pretty vicious stuff, and it was also really strangely written, where there are all these random capital letters in between. But the union got hold of these and made 500,000 copies and disseminated them all over the city. And said, basically, look what's going on in this school, look who you've empowered. There are people who are, what they managed to do was to twin Black power with anti-Semitism, which is a twinning which continues to this day. There's assumption that the two must be intertwined, that Black nationalism must mean anti-Semitism. And yet what was interesting about the conflict was that the school itself hired 350 new teachers, and over half of them were Jewish. Right? They were younger, they were Jewish, yeah.
Way more than half. I'm from Brooklyn. I was in high school.
Okay.
I was a senior in high school that year.
Yeah.
Nearly all the whites across the picket lines were Jews.
Yeah. And the Jews who worked there were consistently spoke out in support of the community board.
Absolutely.
And the community board honored Jewish holidays, which wasn't a practice in any of the rest of the city. And they consistently tried to portray their side of this and to say that this wasn't the case, but their voices were entirely drowned out. And so what struck me about it was that the voices that were able to appear as Jewish voices were only the voices of the union. Whereas there were Jewish teachers, there were members of Brooklyn College, 2 Jewish faculty, who were centrally involved in getting grant money for the project. None of them could appear as Jewish voices, right?
And my mother's high school, which was not even in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, it was open, it was staffed by white Ashkenazi Jewish teachers and the few Black teachers who were there. I mean, what people think about what happened that year is like so completely different from what my friends and I experienced.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, because the way that it really is portrayed is that sort of somehow these liberal lefties who were controlling New York City just gave power over to a group of people without realizing, and it's framed also as pandering, that they were sort of indulging these young Black, these Black community leaders who didn't know what they were doing. And whereas, what I found interesting too is when I did my student teaching as a college student at a charter school in Providence, it's run by this guy named Dennis Litkey, who in the charter school movement was a celebrity, right? And he made himself very famous because he took over a school in New Hampshire in a very poor white area and made it sort of just flourish, right? But when I went for my first day of student teaching, I'd begun discussing his work with him, and it turned out he was a student teacher in those schools. And he credited his entire vision of how to make a school in the service of the community to what he had seen there. But the thing that's sort of sad about it is that Dennis Litkey's become a celebrity for the work that he does, and Rhodey McCoy, after this event went down, there are very few traces of him. There's no, I think he's probably dead now. But I had done an initial search, and so it's interesting sort of that it was able to translate into success for this other figure, and yet for him, it didn't, But one of the questions that many people have asked about the conflict is why it was that many people watching it unfold felt that they had to choose between a left-leaning Jewish union and a community of color, right? And what many people said is this shouldn't have been a forced choice, that if the union had been a progressive union, what they would have fought for was decentralization with strong protections for teachers, right? Which at the time would have been a very progressive move. And yet that's exactly, it didn't happen at all, right? And so what in fact emerged was a sense that the union was the progressive, reasonable voice, that was the progressive, reasonable voice that was sort of looking out for collective coalitional interests, and that the community was not, right? And looking at it, I mean, my honest sort of overall sort of first response is just to say that, you know, it wasn't an experiment without flaws, but what educational experiment has no flaws? There's none, right? And it should have been allowed to exist long enough, you know, to generate concrete results. But the thing, as I'd said before, that really struck me was how it is that in scholarship this has appeared. It's almost presented as consensus that, you know, this shouldn't have existed, that this was a flawed moment, that this is a sign of civil rights movement coming apart, et cetera. And the reason I'm raising it here is that one of the things that strikes me a lot about the present is that I think that question continues. I mean, in other words, which voices can appear as Jewish voices, right? And we're talking about this at Temple, and so I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that there's a way in which neoconservative Jewish voices are able to appear in an incredibly disproportionate way to the numbers of people that they represent, right? I mean, if you were just to look at sort of what it is that appears as Jewish, then I mean, you would think that we're all neoconservatives, right? And so there's a degree of being vociferous, which is completely, I mean, which masks and I think misguides people about its degree of representation. But the other thing that strikes me about it as well is there's an interesting way in which Jews have really been brought in, white Jews specifically, as the authoritative voice in being antagonistic to affirmative action. One of the things that strikes me repeatedly when you sort of listen on NPR, that when somebody's brought in to sort of say from an authoritative stance that affirmative action should no longer exist, it's almost always a Jew, and an Ashkenazic Jew. And part of me is wondering about why that's so. You know, and I think there are a couple different layers to it. I mean, the official story that one's always given about why Jews oppose affirmative action is familiar to all of us, right? You know, Ashkenazic Jews encounter group quotas. They're against group quotas because they're oppressive, right? But I think there's an interesting way in which the authoritativeness of Jewish critics of affirmative action has everything to do with the history of a civil rights coalition. So there's a sense that these were once people who worked alongside blacks. These are people who have an intimate relationship with black communities. And so if they say this, it somehow must have greater credibility or legitimacy, right? But that's linked to the last point that I want to make, which is one of the things that I find, why I find it interesting to revisit something like Brownsville isn't just the question of who gets to speak as Jews, but there's a way in which the grammar that it's set continues. And what I mean is this. If you look at many neoconservative writers, they explain their turn to neoconservatism as arising in the Black Power moment, right? That it was that moment that for them sealed the fact that these coalitions couldn't work, that they were based in a liberalism that was naive, et cetera. But what I find interesting is there's a way in which Jews in the late 60s, white Jews in the late 60s, were framed by former allies as bad friends. And what I mean by that is there's a sense that white Jews care more than other other whites, about the situation of people of color, right? And so there's a sense that, Jews, I mean, some Jews even over-identify with black people, but there's a sense that Jews sort of pay attention, right? But at the same time, one of the fruits of the civil rights movement was that there are many Jews who were able to benefit from civil rights legislation in ways that blacks could not, right? And so why I say bad friends is there's a sense that many Jews sort of know what's wrong with the system and yet benefit from it. And so we'll criticize it and then proceed to get all of its fruits. And so there's a sense that many Jews, white Jews, play this strange role of these kind of funny apologists. And I think in many ways, the move that neocons want to make is to just stop feeling guilty and stop being friends. In other words, to just say, let's just enjoy the fruits and forget any sense that there's a larger problem that's wrong. And I think there's this way in which neoconservatism is all about Black-Jewish relations, and yet it's sort of beneath the surface as this sort of disavowal thing. And so I just want to wrap up by saying that in many ways I see Gary's project as entirely about expanding the ways that voices as Jewish voices can appear. I mean, in the end, the group's called the Cholashon. It's about setting the terms of conversation. many tongues, right? And so I think in many ways the situation that we saw in Ocean Hill-Brownsville is not gone. That when you want to criticize these things, you somehow cease to be Jewish in your criticisms. And that's a major problem. We need to be able to criticize these things as Jews. And if we're able to do that, we'll have made some progress in the direction at which he's looking.
Oh.